1, 2,
Standing
go.
by.
Everybody, you're listening to, and if you're joining us on our live stream, you're potentially watching the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Steve Morey.
I'm Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
And we are your hairy, heavy homos that talk about comic books, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy homo to listen in, or as we said, possibly stream in. And this episode's a little bit different. We haven't been with you for a few weeks. A lot of stuff has happened. Some of it pretty sad, some of it just busy, some of it just ugh. So we're here with you tonight, and because we are all getting caught up with life, what we're going to be doing tonight, instead of doing the Comic Book Bears podcast, we're going to be doing the Book Bears podcast. So I have always maintained that comic book fans are some of the most well-read people you will ever encounter in your life. And I don't think that can be disputed.
True. And
books ain't the only things we read, folks. So we're going to be going through some books that we, whether they are real life or prose, stuff that we're enjoying right now. I have one book that I completed and the other that I'm in the midst of completing. Those are the two that I'm going to be talking about. I'm not exactly sure what the other two gentlemen, what the context will be for them, but we just wanted to provide to you that, we do. Oh, I just knocked my thing off. There we go. We do read stuff other than comics, and we're going to be talking about some of that stuff, and not just the stuff that we are reading currently, but we're also going to be going through some books that have had a big impact on us over time. So we haven't done an episode like this in the past. We did do an episode like maybe a few weeks into the pandemic, if I'm right, Steve, about
it was
books about
2020
comic books. Yeah.
Yep.
And Caleb did not participate in that one, so one of his choices kind of aligns with that, and I'm glad that he's able to get that in. So we'll be going forward with this. So welcome to the Book Bears podcast. Possibly the only time this will be the Book Bears podcast. So,
it's a very special episode.
Yeah, it is. It's a very special episode.
I'm super excited about this, but we had a comment that just popped up and stuff, and he says books without pictures, next comics without words. We should absolutely do a silent comics episode sometime. There are some. There are some amazing Shaolin Cowboy, right? There's some amazing wordless comics out there.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. That comment came to us from Vernon Williams.
My enthusiasm for that.
Bill is less excited than I am.
I go to the far side. I go
I want it wordy.
Or Marvel's Enough Said month,
Give me Ann Nesenti. Give me Ann Nesenti running katana.
Yeah, but there's some good material that's along those lines. I don't know if we can do an entire show about that, but I do think that's something we possibly
would not be very verbose
at some point in the future. Yeah. All right, so I think what we're gonna do is we'll do like our standard Steve Caleb Zanowitz triangle, but when we get to the when we start talking about the books that had an impact on our life, I think I'm going to change it up a little bit. I think I'll go first as the oldest, and then go in descending order. I think that might be a little interesting there. So Steve, why don't we start off with you? Tell us about a book that you're reading.
A book that I'm reading. So this is a book that I have read, and I've read several of his books. This past year, I just started. I had heard that he was really great. He came to Winston-Salem last year for the Bookmarks indie book festival that is here every year. That's sponsored by Bookmarks, which is an independent bookstore that's in town. He's apparently fascinating speaker. I unfortunately missed his talk, but you can actually hear it. They do have recordings of it online if you do look for it. But TJ Clune is known for mostly queer books, and he is also very positive in terms of the feelings that he wants people to walk away with when they've read his books. He does not like sad gay books. His books are sad, but he also does express, and he wants the reader to walk away with a sense of queer joy as well. So he's written some books for YA readers, especially the Extraordinaries, which I actually do have a copy of the first book here, Extraordinaries, about an ADHD kid who's into superheroes in a world where superheroes exist. And he also has several books about sort of like Werewolf Pack. I believe it's Wolf Song, I think is that. I'll have to look that up. But he's done several amazing books recently. And one of my favorites, and this was, I think, his last new release. He does have one coming out soon. But this one is Under the Whispering Door. And it's a very interesting book in that almost all the main characters are dead. It is a book about what happens after you die. And in this, the main character, Wallace, is kind of an asshole. He's this, super gay, super professional, fancy schmancy jerk who dies and realizes that his ghost is still sticking around. And he's helped out by May, who is his reaper, essentially, who picks him up and takes him to a coffee shop run by a gentleman named Hugo. And of course, some of the descriptions early on, you realize, Wallace kind of thinks Hugo's a little cute. And in this world that TJ Clune's presented, souls go through sort of a transitionary period where they feel out their history, their lives, their personalities, and just kind of come to accept what's going to happen to them when they move on, when they're ready to move on. People move on at very different times. Sometimes they hang out in these transition areas like Hugo's coffee shop for years. Like Hugo's grandfather is one of the main characters there, and also his dog, Apollo. But also there are some people who don't accept what's happening to them and just cling to the grief, cling to their shame, cling to any part of their lives that they're so disappointed of. That happens. When that happens, people sort of, become these twisted creatures just, roaming the streets as husks. And throughout the book, Wallace kind of wavers between, actually caring about what he was in life and realizing that he was kind of an asshole, but that he is more than that he can move on from that. And also with the relationship of those people around him, because again, he has had a life that's devoid of meaningful relationships. And here, now that he's dead, he's actually able to sort of create these connections that he didn't think he ever would, and he never did in life. Very emotionally impactful. There's a lot of tears here. I cried like a little baby. Several major scenes in this. Anytime that there is an animal that's involved and a very sweet pet involved, obviously that's going to impact me very strongly. Because at the time, I had just, when I was reading this, I had just lost Marlin, who was my dog of 13 years, I think, at the time. And so it was, it was a very tough period for me, but it helped me through it. And I like those books that really kind of allow you to, get the emotion out, to really understand that your pain is not, in a vacuum, that there are other people that have struggled and, that feel these big emotions and have a way to draw them out. And I think TJ Clune does an excellent way, is excellent doing that. And this, of course, was a very personal book for him as well, because he did lose his partner. And this was, one of the ways that he worked in reading his book. So, Under the Whispering Door, available at finer bookshops everywhere. Support your local bookstore if you can. But it is available, and check it out. And also check out his other stuff too. Don't be scared away by the fact that he is also a YA author. YA books are amazing reads themselves. It's not a genre to shy away from. So
Yeah, no, for sure.
Mhm.
I'm particularly interested in this book. I like when I read fiction, and I tend to be one of those people who reads more literary fiction, and I love books that have that literary quality, but they also dabble in the fantastical. So and I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but there's a short story about a man who basically befriends an angel, and they have to talk about life. So there's this kind of magical literary quality that can be done with a book that can be both very timely, very impactful in the world that we live in, but also have a really tight relationship to the fantastical as a metaphor. And I think that really drives that point home. And in a book like this, I think it's particularly important because I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts on this. I know that as gay men, like, we think sometimes, especially maybe gay men of a different generation, they tend to think differently about end of life scenarios and what a legacy is. Especially gay men who didn't have kids, who don't have that sort of family legacy. What does the end of life look like, and what's going to be left behind for the world, and what mark did they make? So it's interesting to hear this kind of literary fantasy story being told that really discusses that. And I'm curious to know, without spoiling anything, does it explore like this kind of generational shift that we see, where people who are of a younger generation maybe don't have the same weight or fears about the end of life that maybe some other people in our community do?
I mean, Wallace. There is a purpose to Wallace being an older. Like, I mean, I'm not saying like older. I mean, he's in his 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And Hugo, who's basically kind of the ferryman, for literal terms, is younger. He's in his late 20s. He's had loss in his life, but he embraces joy, embraces difference, and to him the legacy is everybody that he helps and everybody that he touches, whereas Wallace is like, I've gone through life keeping myself at a distance to as many people as possible. Like, he has an ex-wife that he treated just so coldly for the entire time they were married, and he was shocked that she shows up at his funeral in the beginning of the book, because he's like, well, why? I mean, I treated her like garbage and I don't have any feelings for her.
Yeah.
There's like a lot of that kind of very interesting personality, but not so much in the way that it really discusses sort of what was happening to the generation that Wallace was a part of when he was growing up, when he was a young adult. That kind of that's not really explored so much, but like the way that he interacts and the way that he understands what it is to be gay is very different from the way that Hugo understands what life is as a gay man. And also, and I don't want to spoil too much, but there is, there was a third man that's involved in this that has a very, very different outcome that I think is more along the lines of sort of the tragic, queer ending. But yeah, I mean, it's really uplifting book. I really loved it. It's very cathartic. There are moments where tears were streaming just down my face, and I was trying to read, and I just couldn't because my eyes are so blurry. Really quick, we do have John Westhoff joining us today, throwing up the cowboy hat and devil horns. I am also roaming the street as a husk, says John. Yeah, hopefully not like these in the book, because that would be kind of gross and weird. But yeah, I absolutely recommend this book for. I'm making it sound very heavy, and it can be very heavy. And like, Caleb, if you come at it from that kind of perspective, and I mean, that's the thing with prose, is that it is available to people from any kind of perspective to just kind of put their stamp on it, and in the way that they read it, you could go down deeply into it and just kind of look at the generational differences, the generation that TJ Clune is from versus the generation of the main character and the generation of the other characters that he's writing. And how they interact. It's very, I absolutely love it. I think it's just a great book of his. I have read several of his other books as well, and I think this one is my favorite so far. But yeah, it's a very different feel from a lot of his other books.
Yeah, if I can just interject here, I found that really interesting, some of the things that you said, Caleb, because I do think, for people of my generation and certainly the generation before my, there was the issue of the accelerated end of life concerns because of AIDS.
Yeah.
And there is a shift in literature, and I don't want to say even in just in gay literature and LGBT creative works, but there is a sense of putting that to the side, that it's not the preoccupation that I think a lot of people had. And I think with that breeds some optimism inherently. So it'd be interesting if I do read a book like this and keeping that in perspective, because it's that's an element I really don't think about too much, but it is a shift. I think there's a lot of people that certainly before my age and of my age were not expecting to live as long as we did, and with that comes a very different world and
possibilities.
But also just a very different expectation of what to anticipate from a lifetime.
Yeah.
And what a lifetime entails. So,
and especially in a society,
I'd be interested because this does sound like an incredibly interesting book. And, I know we've all been touched by loss. And I think I'm going to get to this one, Steve, because it's singing to me.
Yeah.
It's singing to me because it also sounds multi-generational in perspective, and I always love stories like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the book that I got, somebody else sold me on. So maybe we're selling people on this stuff. I do really want to check this out. Yeah,
give these authors money.
Well, I think it's true too because we live in a society that really is tailored towards, make what you can now and amass it and then pass it on to, whatever. But as far as the LGBTQ and the queer perspective goes, Bill, I think you hit the nail right on the head, is that so many of our stories and so many of our experiences and what got out for so long was just queer trauma. And that was kind of what defined us. And it, now that being gay is by no means is the path, easy. It's not like we still all face struggles and difficulties, right? But it's a little bit more accepted and integrated in society as a whole than it ever has been before, at least in the Western culture in the world that we live in. And so we can explore, families and different family functions, like not just adopting kids, but like our chosen family, the brotherhood that we all have, right? We can explore that. There's a TikTok group that is all septuagenarian gay men or octogenarian gay men on TikTok, and they are hilarious, right? And they all live in a group home together, and it's just them making videos and being super queer and gay. Like it's wonderful. And I think that plays into it. But it's so much of this kind of our place in society now lets us tell stories that do not revolve around queer trauma, and I think that's
right.
important.
And I also think with that there's less othering of ourselves,
right?
There's far less othering of ourselves in all types of media and creative formats, and that can only breed incredibly interesting work, I think. Yeah. All right.
Well, I guess it's my turn. I'm going to take the ball and run with it. So the first book that I want to talk about is a book. I don't know if either one of you have read this, but it should be considered a global and national treasure.
I read this book when I was a junior in high school.
It is. Well, I mean, it is, to me, it's just as prescient and timely now as it was then, as it was when it was written, right? It's been called one of the best 100 novels of the 20th century, and that is none other than The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I have my copy here right beside me, a little bit of a different cover. I love the cover that's on here. Here's why this book is cool if you've never read it. Number one, it plays into the fact that I'm terrible with names because your main protagonist does not have a name, right? So I don't have to remember his name. That's great. But it gives him this kind of everyman quality. But there are certain things about which is a literary tool, right? If you don't name a character, it gives it this, it obfuscates it, but makes it malleable, and we can do whatever we want to as readers, right? But there's something specific about this particular man and the life that he leads, and the environment that he's raised in, and the environment that he is dropped into later, that could not be every man, right? It's specific to being something of an African American man in the 60s, during this movement that deal, or 70s even, that deal with this kind of global burgeoning Afrocentric movement, and the pushback against the Red Scare and communism. The book deals with a lot. So the plot starts off, and the whole book goes through this individual's life. This young man is raised in a small southern town, in the late 1950s, early 1960s. He doesn't have a lot of prospects, or at least he doesn't think. But he's given an opportunity to go to a historically black college, an all-black college, and he gets a scholarship. In order to get this scholarship, though, he is forced to fight naked, basically, in a no-holds-barred match for all of these just white people, right? They take all of these young African-American men and they make them fight. I mean, if you've seen Django, then that's kind of what this is, just a blood sport where they degrade these boys, these men. But he wins, right? He gets a scholarship out of it and goes and does very well. He thrives in the collegiate atmosphere. He learns to love learning, and he sees the bridges that it's building him. When one day, because he's a good student, he's given special favors, and he is allowed to be the chauffeur for a uber rich white benefactor of the college. This wealthy white man who gives a lot of money to this all black college, and the wealthy white man is curious, and so he has him take him around, and they go into the wrong side of the tracks. The man sees some things and hears some things that just really set him off, and he needs a drink, right? So this is during Prohibition. They have to go somewhere where they can get a drink, and a brawl ensues, and people are hit. Leads him to getting kicked out of this college. Well, with very few prospects, he pulls some strings and asks the person who leads the college, is there anything? And the guy's like, you know what? Go up to New York. I know somebody. He'll be waiting on you. He'll find you a job. You do some work. Maybe you come back here and get back in school. There's no intention of putting this young man back in that college, by the way. It's all just to get him out of his hair. Well, he goes to New York, and he lands in New York penniless, with very little prospects, and starts to just kind of make his way. And as he's making his way through the city, and he's walking and he's viewing things, and he sees this whole other world that is so, New York, no matter, I forget off the top of my head what borough, I don't know if it's Manhattan or what, that he lands in, is unlike the South, the rural South in Georgia, I think it was, that he was from. And he's taking this all in, and he sees people who own their own businesses, and he starts looking at this world, and there are black people who are invested in their community. And he starts to develop these ideas as he's walking. Inevitably, he finds a place to live. He's given, a very cheap rate by somebody who's a very nice older lady who just needs some help. And he's going about life trying to scrape together pennies and stuff, when he stumbles upon this couple getting evicted. It's this older African-American couple, and they are being pushed out of their house, and their stuff's piled up on the street. And he steps in and he gives a rousing speech, which attracts the attention of this socialist group. I don't know if you could call them specifically communist, but they are certainly socialists. They are a people's movement. They are a labor movement. They are communistic in the sense that they're not supposed to have a specific leader, and they're for the people and moving. And he becomes you can call it a spokesperson, you can call it a puppet, right, for this group, which puts him at odds with some black nationalist movements and a lot of things that's happening in the city at the time. I'll stop with the plot there, because he eventually has to reckon with everything, right? His identity and the world beyond what he knows, what society expects of him, but also what these counterculture movements also place on him, and what they also expect on him. It is a fascinating glimpse into American history, at least from my perspective. That's told through a lens and a viewpoint that I don't think a lot of literature really has tackled for a variety of reasons, right? And what Ralph Ellison is able to do, the pulse that he's able to tap into, the fact that he can deal in a predominantly black story, but he can deal with nationalism, he can deal with the economic the manufactured economic crisis of poverty that we have in this country. He can deal with these kind of global machinations of democracy and of capitalism and of communism and the wheels that turn, and how can one thing function inside the other thing? Can a capitalistic idea, a movement, thrive in a place that's inherently a communistic idea, can it thrive in a place that's inherently capitalistic? What does it mean for a young black man at this time to want to elevate his people while at the same time trying to stay away from black nationalism? And I say all of this as a white dude who grew up in the South, and I don't have the vernacular or the experience to speak to a lot of the experience, other than the fact that I've read the book, right? And I've digested it. And Ellison has done such an amazing job about taking this and writing it in such a way that it can be absorbed and understood by people who don't have that shared experience, who have never been there, who don't know what it's like to live in the 60s, who don't know what it was like in the middle of that civil rights movement, or who don't know what it's like to live in one of the most booming metropolises in the world, in New York, or who don't know what it's like to live as a black man in America, right? But you can digest this, and he gives you a glimpse into the world, and you're able to pull things from that will hopefully make you a more worldly person or a better person. And I think that's a very important book, and I think that's probably why this book has captured the attention and has withstood the test of time. From a literary standpoint, it's fascinating. His chapters are gorgeous. They're glorious. It's a roller coaster. It is a roller coaster of a book. So now, Bill, I know this was a year or two ago that you read this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I read this before you were born. And one thing I have to say is I really appreciate how forward-thinking. Again, I grew up in suburban New Jersey. I'm still in suburban New Jersey. I'll die in suburban New Jersey. I really do appreciate how forward-thinking the curriculum that I had in English classes, where a book like this was assigned, a book like Thomas Mann's Death in Venice was assigned, which almost certainly was probably my first gay literature. I think that the one thing that I do think, because this was Ellison's first novel, is it's overloaded.
It is, yeah.
It's overloaded, and it's. But in some ways, there's a lot of things that are outside of race in the book, which I think is the most surprising thing for people that might read this through contemporary eyes, because I do think that this is for a book for anyone who's never felt they fit in,
right.
Because he does not fit into the black community whatsoever. In this book, he is outside of that as well, and it's kind of like 7 different books in one.
It is.
When you were talking about the plot, it's like you just hit there's so many plot points you didn't hit. There's this incredibly intense period where he's working at a paint company, which is known for its white paint.
They're glistening white
explosion in the boiler room, which is almost like John le Carre. I mean, it's a thriller at that point, and then there's a big tonal shift when he becomes more ensconced in Harlem. And I do think it's worthwhile to read. I think people should be prepared for it. It's definitely a first novel, because this may have been in his head the only time he would ever have the opportunity to address these topics. So it does have that feel, and it for me, it always was overloaded. But it's also, even in 2023, a worthwhile read.
So I completely get that. I don't know. So I like the word overloaded. When I was reading this, I was thinking overwhelming, right? But I think maybe that's purposeful too. And I agree with you. It was, there are aspects of it. It's like, okay, he threw everything in the kitchen sink at this. But to that end, though, you think about what the effect that has on the reader, the anxiety. You don't know where you're going with it. Is this? And we're so used to, right? Like either because our educational system teaches us that way, or it's just easier to hold on through a byline through a book. We're so used to reading a story about one thing. The story is about gayness. The story is about race. This is an economic story meant to be read through a Marxist lens. I don't know at the time that Ellison wrote this that there was any kind of conceptualization of what contemporary thinkers would talk about the intersectional basis of these things, right? People like Bell Hooks, who talk about intersectional feminism, where race is inherently tied to this cis gender heteronormative patriarchal notion of everything that plays into our economy and our capitalism and imperialism and stuff, and how these things overlap. And I wonder if he had have had that vernacular, if he had have had that language, if the story would have been different, because that's inherently what he's telling. He's telling you how all of these things play together, and that they affect, and it's like a series of dominoes that it is impossible to separate them once they have fallen over and toppled on each other. And to me, I found that fascinating, and it kind of had this kind of a fractic effect on me while I was reading it, which I really appreciated, though. And for some people, I think it can be, like you said, over saturated or overwhelming to a point. But I think that that's purposeful to a sense.
Yeah. One thing I want to address with you, and I just want to see how you interpreted this. Because it's not a book that's enjoyable. It's not an enjoyable read whatsoever. The one aspect that almost borders on that is he's continually being mistaken for this gentleman named Reinhardt.
Yeah,
who is not exactly like not exactly a do-gooder. Let's put it that way.
No, but he's everything, right? Like
he's everything, yeah. And that was the one part of the book that ventured, kind of touched on enjoyment in that,
right.
At least from the reader's perspective. But it's also one of the most potent elements of the plot line of having to answer for something you didn't do.
Well, and at that point, it turns into a mystery, right? Like he takes this almost Walter Mosley flair to it, because you're trying to figure out who is Reinhardt. Like he is Reinhardt is a pimp. Reinhardt is a drug dealer. Reinhardt is a street preacher. Reinhardt is a businessman. Reinhardt is a family guy. Reinhardt is a criminal. He is everything, depending on what block he goes to. And I think to that point too, the
preacher as well.
He is. He's a minister. He has a flock, and I think that's showing you how in a place that is this big and this packed with human beings, how you can be anybody from one block to the next, dependent on how you present yourself, and you can get lost. Right? You can have so many personas that you can effectively disappear by being a parent. And I thought that was really cool, especially in a book that's called The Invisible Man. Right?
Yeah.
About,
but with also the added component of race and the added component of stereotyping, even within that community, even within your own community. It's a loaded book. It really is. Like, there's stuff coming back to me now.
Well, and there's no like blatant and inherent line of queerness in the book, but the book is very queer, right? But like you can read queerness into it, especially if you're reading it through a queer lens or like a Marxist queer lens too. There is an underlying queerness to the book, kind of like I would equate the underlying toe to a book like If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. There's or even maybe Go Tell on a Mountain, which I think is more elevated in its queerness and the fact that the kid's thinking about the things he's talking about, but it's never explicitly stated or explored. And James Baldwin didn't really explore queerness in a novel until Giovanni's Room, right? But it has this kind of subdued underlying queer tone and theme that is pervasive throughout the book, in the way that it talks about gender and dynamics and stuff too, that I thought was really impressive.
Okay, cool. All right.
This is the kind of shit I geek out on.
I don't know, maybe.
Steve, is
you
this
can tell,
is this a book?
No, I have not read this.
You've never read. Sorry.
I only just learned how to read. That's why I read comics, because of all the pictures.
Yeah.
But this sounds like a wonderful book. I actually, Ellison was not in my school canon. It was not something that sort of came up much at all. when I was looking at literature. So it's definitely something that I probably should be picking up. Because Baldwin, obviously, yes, but Ellison, no. So
I mean, and just given the time period, it's almost like it almost caps off, because it is like the very early 60s.
Yeah.
It almost caps off that, it almost provides a coda in some ways to things like Catcher in the Rye and On the Road. It definitely, just like Pet Sounds fits in with the Velvet Underground and Nico and the First Stooges album in a weird way. This is kind of like that on the other end. Sorry, I made a musical analogy, but it's
that's
how dare you?
Amazing.
Yeah. Okay. For my book, this came to me by a very strange route. One of my favorite TikTok, Instagram guys is a gentleman named Baker Reads. That's his handle. His name is Bradley Baker. Young guy, 27, cub, deep voice, queer, adorable. Yeah. And he provides these videos with these very brief recommendations for things that he's read. And he usually categorizes them as the books that freaked me out the most, the books that stayed with me the longest, the books that were the saddest things I've ever read. So he always, and it's, for the most part, horror. Sometimes he does venture into other stuff and commentary. There's a few science fiction recommendations that he has, but it's pretty much horror. And this one book, just because of the way he provided the synopsis of it in two different videos and in two very different ways. If you have the graphics, Steve, I would really appreciate if you could put this up. This name of this book is Helpmeet by a Canadian author named Naben Ruthnum. Sorry about that. He also writes, this is in the horror, particularly body horror genre. He also writes thrillers under the name of Nathan Ripley. He's a McGill guy, McGill graduate, Steve. So you got that. He's also a guitarist in a prog rock band. So I'm fascinated, and I don't think he's over 40. So that I find that really fascinating. So anyway, the term helpmeet is an antiquated term for spouse, and it would have been one of the terms that was used in the year 1900 when this book takes place. So it's set initially in New York City, and Louise and Edward Wilk are a prominent couple, or I should say a formerly prominent couple. Edward was a physician, and he was a philanderer. He was often in the brothels. Louise, who was his former nurse, became his wife, was a long-suffering partner in this. And over time, through sickness and other bad financial dealings, their position in society is dwindled a bit. And at this point, Edward gets very, very sick. And initially it's thought to be syphilis because of his activity. And then it turns out, no, none of those treatments are working. It can't be syphilis. And Edward, in part to run from creditors and to get out of the society that they were once part of, which they still have ties to, decides that he is sure he's going to die, and he wants to die in his ancestral home up in the woods by Buffalo, New York. So Louise, who is kind of a powerhouse, when she's given the role of caregiver, basically takes over everything. And what we are subjected to in the, I would say, like, at the almost like 20% mark of the book, is some intensive body horror, because Edward's body is letting him down. You mentioned the term husk, Steve. You don't know how much alignment there is with that. I don't want to spoil too much, but the malady that he's contending with is possibly occult, is possibly magical. And at the same time, it may not be a case where he's dying, but that he's transforming. And this touches on a lot of things. And the most amazing thing through this is that it's a romance. It's a love story between these two people. And there's an ending that my mouth dropped, and even with that, because there's things I just cannot give away because it would so impact your reading experience on this. It actually has this insane feel of like a silver lining to what's happening to Edward, and how it's weird because it's not necessarily a story about codependency, but it's a story of devotion and of possession and of becoming one with the person that you love the most in the world. The best horror stories, they kind of force you to look at the world a little differently. And there's an elegance to the writing here. You almost feel like it was written in 1900 because of a lot of the tricks that he employs. But at the same time, you know that no body horror story could have existed at that time and gotten any press. This was like it's a short book. It's under 100 pages. It's a novella, and the pricing on Kindle is appropriate. It's less than like $4. And this is probably the closest I've ever come to reading a dream. It has this atmospheric, and I said again, elegance. There's an elegance to this story, which is also surprising because it does involve truly horrific circumstances. And I never would have read a book like this if not for a cute cub saying it was cool. So that's how things happen sometimes. So I heartily recommend this. Make sure you have the lights on. And make sure that maybe make sure it's a night that your other half is home, because there's some really stunning, gross stuff that's his body literally falls apart, and it's disgusting. But through it all, there's this beauty to it in the end. And I've never read a book like this, and I never thought I would enjoy a book like this, but I came away with such a positive feel for this, and I do sincerely recommend this book to other people.
Cool.
So I've never read this, but the way you talk about it reminds me a little bit of, have you ever read the story The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman?
No.
Why does that sound familiar? That sounds so familiar.
Basically, the story is there's a woman who is basically bedridden. She's trapped in the home that her husband bought for her. We don't know what she's ill of, if she's ill of anything, but she's trapped there. And so as she's walking, there's a very Faulkner-esque moment where she's just watching the world outside of her window, people coming and going, but she can't go be a part of it. And so she starts to just like notice the yellow wallpaper and the designs in it. Mm-hmm. And she starts to like imagine that she's trapped behind it, and then she is trapped behind it, and she's immersed and becomes part of the landscape of the wallpaper, and and she's fighting against it, and then so it's not body horror as much as like Bill said when you said it was like reading a dream. It's that very ethereal thing to where reality blends into, and it's all fiction, right? So you're reading it and you're like, I can't tell, what the reality of the fiction is and what the fantasy of the fiction is and how it blends together. But she's slowly going insane because she's trapped in this room. And so as you're speaking of it, that's what it reminded me of. And if you haven't read that, it's a wonderful horror story.
Yeah. Like Steve, it's ringing a bell. So I don't know if it was an influence on another work or possibly a song.
Could have been.
You could have been. Yeah.
It's because if you like the story that you just told, and it's a short story, it's like a very quick read, so you can knock it out in no time. It's literally it's not even a novella, like it's, I don't think 20 pages long. It's good. Yeah, check it out because I think you dig it. But that's what it reminded me of when you were talking about it. I need to check this out.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I've read true horror.
It's been ages since I've read a horror book.
Yeah. I mean, like even some of the last horror that I've read is not really necessarily, horror. I mean, like My Best Friend's Exorcism. There's a lot of humor and tongue in cheek and, parody as sort of like part of a book like that. Well, basically anything that Grady Hendrix writes is, steeped in that kind of black humor that I love so much.
I think the last horror I read that's actually horror was I reread Clive Barker's story collection.
Mm-hmm.
It's got like the Midnight Meat Train and stuff in it, and that's again body horror, but that's a different vibe and tone.
Hold on to Clive Barker. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Awesome, but yeah, I will check this out because I have seen the same book talker, and it's.
I mean, there's so many. There's so many books
enticing.
that the book about the whatever the crow named Shitbird and how the animals deal with the zombie apocalypse. I mean, some of these books I never would be exposed to this stuff ever, and there's a lot of stuff I want to read because of the descriptions. Yeah, but this was the first one, so.
There's a pile. It's growing up next to your comic book pile. That's
oh. Let's not talk about it. All right, Steve, let's talk about something else that you're reading right now.
So one of the things that Jason and I did when we moved here after like the first couple of months is that we went and we joined the local queer book club. And it was actually the inaugural year. They I guess attempted to do it as part of the specifically as part of the local LGBTQ center, but this was actually sponsored by the bookstore, and so it actually was able to get like a little bit bigger of an audience, and we've been going to it for over 5 years now. So it's definitely one of the one of my things that I look forward to every month. We have a once a month meeting with a new book, and absolutely love it. It's just part of our world now, part of our life that we just love. And the last book that we read for September was this book, When Women Were Dragons, and this had some interesting debates in the club meeting. This book itself, it's set in the 50s for most of it, the 50s and then into the 60s a little bit, in an alternate reality where women en masse, about 650,000 women in the U.S., turned into dragons in 1955. They just turned into dragons. They stopped being women, turned into dragons. Some of them ate their husbands, some of them burned down their houses, and they flew off and just kind of went where they went. Some of them went to the jungle, some of them went into space, some of them went underwater. Like it's just what happened. But very interestingly enough, this is the 50s that gave rise to the Red Scare. Well, I mean the second coming of the Red Scare. Like this was McCarthyism era, 1950s. And in a situation like that, in a society like that, where hundreds of thousands of women, specifically women, turn into dragons and disappear, the mindset of the society, the mindset of the government, and everybody was, just don't think about it. Just forget it. Some of you have lost mothers, sisters, aunts, whatever. Just don't even think about it. It's not important. We just won't talk about it, and maybe it'll go away and never happen again. And it's very much an interesting parable for the feminist movement, the burgeoning feminist movement in the the 50s to the 60s. The second, that sort of like really, I guess, first to second wave feminism, but also the queer movements. The idea that women could be lesbian, that lesbians exist, that's in here as well. But it is a very, and also like the idea of transitioning and the trans, the idea of transness as well. I think, and we talked about this a little bit with Invisible Man, there's a lot in here. The author, Kelly Barnhill, this is not her first book, but it does kind of read like a first novel in that there's a lot. So there's a lot of confluence. There's, yes, there's intersectionality, but sometimes I think there's a little bit too much. And so in certain cases, the metaphor kind of gets squishy and kind of gets lost. If you take it from like a queer lens, if you're reading this through a queer lens, it is very much a great, a great metaphor for the lesbian experience. One of invisibility, one where your emotions are so oppressed, your self is so oppressed that it's shunted away as part of society in a different way, and may express itself explosively, as in you become a dragon and breathe fire and have like big claws and wings and all sorts of stuff. But there's also a quietness about this book, and I think a lot of that comes from the way that she writes her protagonist, who starts the book as a little girl. She narrates through the entire novel from a place in the future, but she sees her aunt, who's this strong lesbian woman who just up and abandons her daughter, her baby daughter, to become a dragon, and the daughter is then raised as her sister. Her parents are absolutely like, this is your sister. She's always been your sister. There's never an aunt. I never had, there's no other family. This is the way it's been because. And her mother, of course, long suffering, but strongly feminine. There's also another idea of like, hereditary magic and, heritage and a through line of family and the strength of women kind of holding everything together. Just kind of still tries to create this normal life for her daughter and her niece in a world where women can just become dragons. And men obviously do not like that, but also other women are terrified of that happening to themselves because it's so strong. There was a lot of opinions about this book, and I think it's definitely popular. It's definitely in a lot of top 20 lists right now. I would recommend it, but it depends on how you want to read it. If you want to look at it as pure entertainment, go ahead. It's a fun read. There's a lot of really interesting parts to it. It's a lot of interesting, somewhat funny things do happen, as well as that kind of like, frustration that comes from seeing the position of women in the 50s and the 60s where they're being silenced, and then of course breaking free from that. Also, it's got a lot of dragons like doing things that dragons normally don't do. But also, if you're looking at it as a feminist work, as sort of like a social, a harsh social critique, there are some criticisms there, and that doesn't really succeed in everything that it tries. But, again, it's up to the reader how they want to approach it. So, When Women Were Dragons. I don't know if anybody has read this book or if it's been recommended to you, but it is interesting. It was fun. It was an enjoyable read. There are some really tearful moments in here, and of course, I'm Mr. Cathartic, so I love crying a lot when I read books. And there's a bunch of really great moments, but there's also some laugh out freaking loud moments that I was not expecting in this book, and I think those are some of my favorites. In the I was not expecting to laugh, but then here you go. Here's something ridiculous.
I want to know what was going through Bill's head when you were talking about women turning into dragons, because Lucille Ball sprouted wings in my brain and just went, yeah, that's what happened, and that's why I was laughing, because I saw like Lucy going after Desi, like just.
See, I had a different perspective. Like my head went to a movie like Far From Home. Was that not Far From Home? What's it called? Far From Heaven with with
Juliette
Moore.
Juliette Lewis was in that? Juliette Moore. Yeah.
And that type of 50s mentality, or I think more recently Carol.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, where it was like that type of housewife.
Yeah.
that turned into it. So I imagine it's more along the lines of that. That's where my head kind of went.
That's exactly what it is, but it could be anything. Like all sorts of women change, and also some drag queens change. So there's some talk about that where it's like, a men's only club, 3 women, 3 drag queens, female impersonators are performing. They have number finishes. They step out of their skins. The wigs fall off, and they become dragons and fly away. And to thunderous applause from all the men in the audience. So it's like, it's very, there's some moments in this where you're sort of like, wow, is this, is this the metaphor for transness, or is it just anybody who feels any kind of female power or energy flowing through them? Like if they, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think that's where, you kind of have to work your way through the narration, and that's kind of where there's some frustration.
Okay,
because the narrator is
the only question I have is just from something that you alluded to right at the beginning. Does this story look back at this story, or is it told contemporaneously?
It's a little of both. So there's, the narrator, of course, starts her story in the future, but she is the young girl who is experiencing all of these things firsthand. Okay. Interspersed throughout, there's also scientific documents that recount, different aspects of the dragoning as it happens, the biology behind it, speculation, etc. We do have a couple more people who've joined us, actually. James Figueredo, I love that premise. A good evening, handsome gents. But also Vernon, also can drag on queens. Yes, that's exactly it. Dragon queens does happen in this. But yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot to be said for the entertainment value of this. But if you're looking for strict feminist reading, some people, from the feedback that I got, some people were disappointed that it wasn't as cohesive as it could be, because I think she tried to put so much in here. It's like, yes, you can read it as queerness, you can read it as transness, you can read it as feminine, you can read it as, just a socialist critique of, mid-century whatever. Like, everything is kind of in this. But where she succeeds, where she, where Kelly Barnhill really kind of succeeds, I think, is keeping the interest and keeping the understanding there, and not solving all the mysteries. So,
all right, cool.
But yeah.
All right, let's go over to Caleb. Caleb, tell us about a book that you have too.
Yeah. So number one, I just want to shout out to Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals for just rocking me, putting me back on top of my fantasy league. So thank you for that. But no, so we've talked about a lot of fiction tonight, right? And I love fiction. We read comic books. We live in a world. We dive into these worlds with superheroes and fantasy and drama and everything. But nonfiction has a very special place in my heart. Like, I love reading nonfiction. I really do. I'm fascinated by the way that people remember the world and the way that they recall facts and they tell these stories, because it is the story of us, right? Especially when they're going back. And I picked the two books tonight to talk about specifically because they both deal very heavily with the same time frame. They're both very much about this post-World War II, leading up to the 1960s Vietnam era, this kind of window into America. They both deal with things like burgeoning communism and collectivism and the social mores of what evolved from New Deal democracy, right? One of them is dealing with made-up characters, is focusing on blackness and in New York. The other one also takes place largely in New York in the northeastern area, but it's about Lev Gleason, who, if you are familiar with comics, and you should be familiar with this name, and we certainly spoke about a lot of his characters on the show, specifically the Daredevil, but Lev Gleason was a very interesting man, and he's very important to, even though he hasn't been around in a long time, he's very important to the state of comic books today. He was one of the major and most dynamic publishers of comic books, and really did help put comic books over when they were at their peak, when 70% of Americans were reading comics. That was large. That was not completely. You can't just lay that at his feet, but he played a big deal in it, right? Very much an important figure in the publication world. Famously was brought a character and given the chance to publish it, but he did not think it would sell because he didn't think anybody would be interested in reading about this reporter who could, leap tall buildings and was faster than a speeding bullet and went by the name of Clark Kent. So he passed up the opportunity to publish that, which history shows may have been a mistake. But also it could have, history, had he taken it, it may not have been what it was. So who knows? But we're not talking about comic books tonight, right? Like, this is a window into the comics publishing world at the time. And I think it's fascinating from that aspect. But here's why I loved this book too. This is not necessarily a story about a guy who created comics, a guy who dealt with superheroes, a guy who wrote crime comics, right? This is a story about the protection of the First Amendment in the United States. This is a story about, to kind of paraphrase, and we hear this phrase a lot now, the soul of America. This story focuses a lot around McCarthyism and the Wortham book that was brought out, and the way that comic books were lambasted and demonized as being a detriment to the young mind, and were kind of the same arguments that we hear about video games and how they just rot the brains of children and they encourage violence and this idea, so much to the point that comic books were drug in front of the mass populace, right? The House Un-American Activities Committee had major studies done into comic books, and not done in the best ways. And people like Frederick Wortham wrote this treatise on how bad they were. And even though he made up half of his facts, and he committed, academic malfeasance in doing so, kind of got the upper hand for a little bit. And how people like Joseph McCarthy used these books and the connections of people like Lev Gleason with them to really stir up the Red Scare, and to kind of go into censorship, and to really crush socialist movements. That's what this book is about. It starts off, Lev Gleason was a veteran. He fought in World War II. He fought World War. No, he fought in World War II. Did he go back into World War II? I can't remember. So I know he was in one. He actually did go back later on to serve in some capacity after World War I, but I don't remember if it was World War II. I'd have to go back and check with that, because there's a whole big thing where he was married and he was publishing in comics. And after I think it was World War II, because it was after we got back into it. He actually re-enlists and has to go move and stuff and get back into the game. And he does so in a publishing capacity, right? Like, he wasn't on the front lines, but he was a hard worker. He was a dynamic figure. But he had some things that were instilled in him from a very early age, that he believed in fairness and freedom. He didn't understand race relations as they were. He was not Jewish, but he had many, many, many people in his life that were. He cared about them dearly. He was early on pushing against isolationism in that era. And after the war, whenever he comes back and he starts to publish and he's talking about these things, globally speaking, people started fighting back against fascism, and specifically the Spanish Civil War. Lev became very heavily involved with raising money and sending money to bring those people who had fought against fascism in Spain, to get those refugees out and get them a place to live, which had ties to communism. And so those ties get brought out mainly by other publishers, newspaper publishers who didn't like them. They helped bring this stuff into the atmosphere, and really just trashed Lev Gleason's name. Lev Gleason was a very potent speaker, but once he became persona non grata, it really took the wind out of his sails. It crushed him, and this man was very self-motivated, had a high esteem of himself, and rightly so, right? But so there's this one example where, and Bill, you're going to have to help me out with this, because I'm again terrible with names. The publisher of EC Comics, the man who made EC the horror, his father passed on. William Gaines, yeah. So they're in the second kind of round of comics being brought in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee and lambasted by the government. They brought William Gaines up to talk about censorship, and William Gaines put his foot in his mouth, saying, hey, I'm the one who decides when it's enough. Here's why this little blood trickling down over here, that's not bad. If it had been this other thing, which I could totally do anyway, that would be inappropriate. And I'm the one who draws the line. Lev Gleason got so infuriated that they ignored his request to be the one to testify, that he just essentially bowed out. And by the time the era was over and they'd gotten past it, he couldn't sell comics anymore. He couldn't raise money the way they used to, and he disappeared. And the fun thing about it is no one knew where he went until people put some things together. And his nephew, Brett Dakin, actually wrote this book. Brett is a lawyer. He went to Harvard, was not particularly interested in comic books, but he had read a few of them, and he knew through family history that his uncle was a publisher and was very big. His uncle was Lev Gleason. And he would hear his story. So he had to go after the fact and start putting these puzzle pieces together and start to flesh out this story based on word of mouth, and go hunt down these people and go to the National Archives and really flesh out these things and get documents from the FBI on the Freedom of Information Act. Lev Gleason had a stack this big of files from the FBI. They were watching him, right? Like they had a huge file on him, and letters from Eisenhower himself about who Lev Gleason was. It's insane. And I love this because, again, it shows an insight into America and some of the same reciprocal problems that we're still having today, and some of the same arguments and pushbacks and censorship that still involve comics. And to me, it really illustrates and drives home the point about how comics have been on the front lines of fighting for civil liberties and the First Amendment in this country in a way that very other written mediums have been. And it's less than 100 years old. It is a brand new medium, right? This is something that comic books have not existed the way that prose has existed in entirety. But they've been on the front lines. Comic creators have been fighting for our rights, people like Tom Finland and all of that stuff. So fascinating glimpse into America, fascinating glimpse into the law and into how it affects and the kind of impotency we've had as a country with dealing with these things. Loved it. It was very much a mystery adventure of literary nonfiction. I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. One thing I think that needs to be said is one of the reasons why he was a principal figure in the Kefever. What was the hell was the Kefever? I forget the name of the government inquiry into comic books. Was that though Lev Gleason Publications didn't have a big output, they had two of the top selling comics at the time, Daredevil comics.
Crime
and that's an
pay.
Interesting story because Daredevil eventually got forced out of his own comic by the supporting cast, and Crime Does Not Pay, which is a huge element of post-war comic book success. I mean, it was a huge book.
Yep.
Do they go into Bob Wood?
Yes, he's mentioned.
That's a book in and of itself. Yeah.
Very much is. Bob Wood is talked about. All of his partners are discussed. Both his creative partners and his business partners.
Yeah.
His wife, who also ran one of his newspapers at the time, has a starring role in this, as well she should, and who is very much the same. Very much an activist, just like he was. They get into all of that and so much more. I just did check. He did serve in both wars. He was born in 1898, served in World War I, and then was almost kind of like shanghaied into an officership in the Second World War on the home front. So, Bill, just out of curiosity, do you know after he quit comics and quit publishing, do you know what he went and did when he disappeared?
No. I know that there's a lot of connections with his former personnel in advertising in the New York area.
Mm-hmm.
But I do not know. And that's one of the things where it's like, God,
I want you to read this book because your eyes are going to go this big around.
I'm sure they will. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't just deliberately look at some of the squibs on this because I want to be surprised because I heard it's like kind of not shocking, but oh my, you're
just like really like, wow. Really? Oh, yeah. Okay. Like,
well, I did hear he went by the name of Reinhardt and was sort of working his way through Manhattan.
Okay, so for myself, I am also like Caleb in that the majority of stuff that I choose to read is nonfiction. It's been that way for at least since the mid-90s, and as you see what's in back of me, there's a lot of CDs and some, Beatles anniversary albums.
Accoutrement.
Yeah. I am halfway through this book, according to my bookmark.
Holy moly.
And it's a 647-page book. So the one that I'm talking about as my second choice here is Sweet Dreams, The Story of the New Romantics by Dylan Jones. And the New Romantics were a new romantic music. I'm not sure how exactly you want to characterize this. Came out of England in the early 1980s. You'll see there that's the Blitz Club, and there's some people that you may find familiar if you're a music devotee, including Steve Strange of Visage and Midjour and Billy Curie of Ultravox. And initially as Billy's and then Blitz and Club for Heroes, when extending into the WAG Club, there were a series of clubs in London in very late 79 into the 80s that catered to basically the post-punk crowd. Punk had come and gone unless you were kind of like in that second and third wave of punk, which was kind of cannibalizing on itself with acts like the Cockney Rejects and UK Subs. It wasn't exactly the same as the Pistols or the Clash. So what was this next this next not generation, but their younger brothers and sisters, what did they have? And the music that was played at these clubs was very often stuff like Kraftwerk, a lot of the German krautrock that was a little more dance oriented. Disco was an element to that as well. Some of the more interesting disco records, like records by Space and stuff that Giorgio Moroder touched. Berlin era Bowie, touch of glam. It didn't really have its own sound until these people that were at these clubs started forming their own bands. And in terms of London's Point Zero, that would be the second mark of Ultravox. That would be Spandau Ballet. That would be Visage, which was a studio group that grew out of the relationships that were happening at these clubs. And it eventually extended to other areas of the country, like Birmingham, which found the formation of Duran Duran, which were musicians who were very much in the same perspective, that were absolutely affected by punk, but didn't necessarily reject what was happening concurrently or what was happening beforehand, stuff like glam, that they were forming this own movement. This book takes a much more broader perspective of what is the new romantic sound. There were acts that certainly had a social connection to these clubs that I would never consider new romantic music, whether it be Wham or Sade. The title comes from Eurythmics, which again they bring in a lot of synth pop elements. So you do have discussions about acts like Soft Cell and Depeche Mode and other acts like that. So for me, it paints a much broader scope of what would be considered new romantic than my prejudices provide. But as a snapshot of time of essentially 1980 to 1985, so far it's been a fascinating read. And I especially love any books that give you the soundtrack in the back of recordings from 1975 up to. So, there really are very few musical movements that have a year zero. It all culminates. And as far as I'm concerned, that stuff that was emerging when I was 13, and that musically, that's an incredibly important time, man. 13 to 14 years old, there's a lot of stuff that's set when you start listening with a little more mature, with ears that are a bit more mature. And I'm not through it all, but I'm glad I'm reading it. Sweet Dreams: The Story of the New Romantics by Dylan Jones. And
I mean, it's a lot. I mean, that I'm not surprised that book is, the size of the phone book. Mm-hmm. If you kids remember what the phone book used to look like.
Yeah. And it's also interesting because, even though there were characters that were not queer, that were part of it, one who's actually become a pretty good Facebook friend, Chris Sullivan, they created their own culture. All these fashion was incredibly important, and so much of that had a queer influence. And of course there were, whether it be Steve Strange or Boy George or Marilyn or Mark Almond, I mean, there's a huge contingent of queerness here. But it's also interesting of the cross-sectional element to it, of straight guys in their mother's clothes. Just because that's where things were headed at this particular snapshot point in time. And it's really been a fascinating read. There's a lot of records I pulled out again because I needed to hear them again because they start describing them.
So it's fascinating. I've read a lot of rock bios, right? Like rock, but I've never read a book about a genre. Like I've read about bands. Yeah. So, I mean, I've got a stack full of them, in other rooms for everything from the Beatles and the Grateful Dead to Marilyn Manson to Tommy Lee from just hair metal and stuff like that. I've never read a book about a genre before. That's interesting. That is a interesting concept.
Well, you better hang on because I got more for you.
Okay, I'm excited about
formative books.
I'm excited. I've got like 4 more comics related nonfiction books I need to mow through in the next couple months, and then I may take a break and read some musical stuff. I'm excited about
and
that.
also it's very interesting because when you think of acts that remain popular now, like The Killers or Vampire Weekend or a couple of others, there's elements of that sound that are still there. It's not, it hasn't died. And especially, their openness to disco, their openness to funk, particularly, funk eventually has a very big place in what kind of is a second wave. And, groups like Blue Rondo a la Turk and a Latin influence. And then later with Spandau Ballet with Chant Number 1, which has a huge funk influence. They were basically ready to take anything on. There's even arguably heavy metal elements to it because some of these guitarists were kind of steeped in that, and that just doesn't go away. Right. Andy Taylor of Duran Duran, admittedly is a huge Jimmy Page fan, and it's there. And of all the genres that I would say is where this tired description of a mixing pot, a melting pot. This one kind of claimed the closest to my ears of throwing in what essentially were very disparate elements into something that became its own thing. So, Sweet Dreams. Okay, so I'm not sure. I think I got a little more into this than the other guys. But Steve, I'm going to be putting through the paces. So I just wanted to provide some of the books that really had a big influence on myself growing up that were not comic books. So Steve, I don't know what you have prepared.
So interestingly enough, for the audience who's watching this, I've separated some of these books into kind of chunks based on the eras of Bill's life. Young Bill is probably the biggest chunk because it really kind of goes all the way through what he would have been reading up through the 70s. But then also I have a separate section for music and a separate section for film. So I think I think we could start with
Let's start with Young Bill.
Let me know. I mean, these aren't. I'm trying.
Little Timmy Zanowitz. Let's start with him. Okay.
Yeah, trying to keep these in some order, so I might need to jump back and forth. Just let me know.
Okay. First of all, the first meta book of all time, The Monster at the End of This Book, by starring lovable Furiel Grover. It's not credited here, but the writer was John Stone, who was the executive producer on Sesame Street, and let me tell you. That gentleman. So, oh boy. But the first meta book I ever encountered, the first book that ever talked to me. So then we go to Encyclopedia Brown, Boy Detective. I know there were some kids that gravitated towards the Hardy Boys. Encyclopedia Brown was my guy. I particularly like Encyclopedia Finds the Clues because I thought that was the first book in the series, which I think was the fourth one, where the adults started to take him seriously. That he actually knew what he was doing in trying to find these ultimately stupid cases. But I loved Encyclopedia Brown growing up. Judy Blume's books were huge. Some of it is the suburban New Jersey thing. I know because that's basically the world that she grew up in. 2 books that had a huge influence, the narrative of a black family moving into a predominantly white area in Iggy's house, and then Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, the first of the Fudge books. Huge impact on me. Love those. Then what do we have next? Scholastic Book Fair for the win.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like... Yeah.
It's taking you back. Okay, Steve, what do you got next? Oh, A Wrinkle in Time. Possibly the first science fiction book I read. Possibly, maybe, a timeless book about that family and the stuff that goes on. Let's go into the next one. That's a little bit out of order, but Rumblefish. Okay, so Splinter of the Mind's Eye. This came out when I was 10, and it's the first sequel to Star Wars that was published apart from comic books. And to this day, this would be an incredible film. It has such a cinematic feel to it. Stuff they'd have to change. There's almost like a quasi kiss between. There's this intimacy between Luke and Leia in these caves, but the whole thing with the caves. Oh man, this is such a good story. It's a shame that doesn't go back. If you can go back a little bit, Steve, just because it was when we're talking about books that are considered young adult that have some potency, S.E. Hinton's book, The Outsiders, and that was then This Is Now, or probably the most prominent ones, but for me it was Rumblefish.
Yeah.
And to me, this is the one with the closest to a queer sensibility. If we can go forward back again, Birdie. This was the first real adult book I read. The author William Wharton did not publish a book until he was 53. And it is a book that, though it's about two young men, it's about the benefit of a mature recollection. And to this day, there's a line in the book very early on when Birdie shits at the semi-hard mass. For a 12-year-old to read that, it wasn't anything I was used to. And there's passages in that book that stick with me to this day. It was later made into a movie, and inexplicably moved the war that the two men were involved with from World War I to Vietnam. Inexplicably did that. It's not a comparative experience, but if you can find this book, it's again, I'll go back to what was said before about being dreamlike. This was kind of like that as well because of the allegories to flight. Then what do you got next here in my these are a little out of order here, Steve. The Amityville Horror, a true story. Probably not, but I'm a child of the 70s, and that just hit me hard. Lots of cool stories that I've talked about before in the past on the show, but definitely a book that hit me. Into college, Beloved, which you had up there. Steve, these are all out of order. Beloved was a book that was the first time I really it was the first time a book really sang to me from a culture that was not mine. Beloved by Toni Morrison, a stunning book. I love all of John Irving's works, whether it be Garp or the Cider House Rules. There's a lot of stuff. The one that I think is the most interesting because it's the most insane group of characters, and that it is a family of these insane characters gives it such added potency. The Hotel New Hampshire. Really love that book. Jaws by Peter Benchley. Again, child of the 70s, mandatory reading. Even if you saw the film, you had to read the book, because there's all kinds of stuff in the book that's not in the movie, like a romance between two characters and just more specific information about shark hunting. And it remains a great read. Les Miserables. Okay, so this is probably the only true classic that ever really resonated with me. And again, some of it was the exposure to the musical, but since it did have the since there was a renewed interest in the core storyline of Les Miserables, we did get a more complete and unabridged versions that were easier to get. It's tough to get through this. There's a sequence that's like almost like 40 pages about the history of the Navy in France. It seems to come out of nowhere, but it's a rough read. But it's an expansive read, and it's an epic, however you look at it. And probably in terms of pre-20th century literature, probably my favorite. All the President's Men, again, child of the 70s. My parents did not understand why I wanted to read this book, but I did, when conspiracy theories were fun. And, with that, a lifelong interest in true stories and nonfiction.
All right, so we can move on to music.
Okay, music. Okay, so the first two I believe you're going to put up are The Beatles Forever by Nicholas Schaffner, and then another book by the same gentleman, The British Invasion. These were books that made me a fan for life of the Beatles, and then subsequently the other groups that were part of what we call in the States the British Invasion. They don't call that in England because they didn't invade their own country. It's basically called the Beat Music era. Some other names as well. Interesting factoid about Nicholas Schaffner: he was a very early AIDS casualty, died in 1981, with a connection to the steward. He was a key component in figuring out the original AIDS trajectory of infection, and also interestingly from my hometown of River Edge, New Jersey. So there were a lot of things that spoke. Now, Caleb, you were talking about genre, that you don't really have books about musical genres, and they're mostly about the acts himself. This is one I heartily recommend. It's England's Dreaming by John Savage, which goes through the punk movement in the 1970s in the UK. Again, it comes from a perspective that none of this was in a bubble. Of course, there were elements from the 1960s and the garage bands that influenced, of course, the New York bands that, almost immediately preceded the punk phenomenon in the UK. But just a smart read, and one of these books that I can't imagine somebody reading and not wanting to investigate some of the music that's described within it, and absolutely great back material in terms of the discography that's recommended. And this is just a favorite. This is Punk Diary. This is by George Gearmark. He is someone who was a fixture in Texas radio. And he put together what basically is a day-by-day guide to punk music in the UK from 70 to 79. Helps to have some more than a little basic understanding going in with this book, but it's one of the most fun reads I've ever had. So in terms of another book that is a band-specific one, this is Records of Civilization, the story of Coombe Transmissions and Throbbing Gristle by Simon Ford. Throbbing Gristle basically were the originators of what we now call industrial music, and their story is fascinating and epic and sexy and unhinged, and this really is an amazing tale of a group that had a huge importance on the trajectory of music, though you would never know it from listening to them.
I wonder if Simon Ford had much to do with the documentary that came out. I think it was 2 years ago.
I don't think he did, because but there's actually there's that one, and then there's also one that is from like a fairly exploitative label called Chrome Dreams, but it's again industrial music. It's centered on Nine Inch Nails, but the prehistory, which does cover Throbbing Gristle, excellent treatment in that. Okay, then I guess we're gonna go. Is the next thing film?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So film, I'm a huge classic film fan, and a lot of that in the pre-video era, where you had to go to video stores and rent, and didn't have TCM and didn't have a lot of other things at your fingertips. You needed, and didn't have Wikipedia, you needed material like this. So these are 4 books that were really important to me. Cary Grant, A Touch of Elegance by Warren G. Harris. Most of the books about Cary Grant relate to either his film craft or his influence as a fashion icon, or their personal stories from like his last wife or his ex-wife Diane Cannon, or their daughter Jennifer, or they're a bit salacious. This one covers this basically is the distillation of all of that. They don't shy away from the gay rumors. They don't shy away from his use of LSD as a therapeutical device, but I found this one to be the most balanced, and it's an excellent read. Love this book. One story that is just lost to time is the story of Clara Bow, who was, basically, was the principal embodiment of the flapper era, and just had some insane stories in her personal life, and how you could just take this book and make it into a wonderful film, Running Wild by David Sten. And then I've had a lifelong interest in the films of the Hal Roach Studios, and these are two books of their two main properties that that I think are excellent. Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies. And prior to Leonard Maltin gaining notoriety through Entertainment Tonight, and as a film critic, he wrote a book about Our Gang, which, would be very different today because of what's available at your fingertips. This reads as a labor of love, and The Life and Times, Our Gang, The Life and Times of the Little Rascals, one of the best books on film ever. And then lastly, we're going to go to the murder thing. I guess I'm a murderino without knowing it. And some of these are fiction and some of these are nonfiction. The Alienist by Caleb Carr. This was the last book I would say that really blew me away, where I had to put it down and come back to it and again get back to it, just because I had to be in a better place mentally to read it. And this centers around the period in New York City where Teddy Roosevelt was the chief of police, and there is a serial killer, and it's the first time that they employ psychology to try to figure out what will happen next. A wonderful book. There's sequels to this. There was a limited television series on it. It's billed there as an ingenious thriller, and it is. And then James Ellroy, Mark Dark Places. James Ellroy is the writer of works like LA Confidential and White Jazz and The Black Dahlia. And this is the story of the real life murder of his mother and his search for basically what happened, who was the murderer, and how this affected him. This is a very, very riveting, uncomfortable read, but worthwhile. The next book that you have here, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Okay. No one's going to confuse this with great literature, but it is one of the most fun reads about a murder you will ever encounter. I hate to say that because someone ended up dead. The reaction to the film I thought was interesting, because I think if you do read this book, and again, this is about the denizens of Savannah, Georgia, which has its own magic.
Yes.
With the film that was directed by Clint Eastwood, was not well received, I would say, in a broad sense, but I think some of that is, it all depends when you read Midnight in the Garden of Evil, who you gravitate towards, who you connect with among those cast of characters. If it's Joe Odom, you're not going to love the movie at all. If it's the Lady Chablis, you're going to enjoy the hell out of the movie. There's just something very magical about this book. And I love everything about Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, I have to say. It was a bit of an obsession for a time. And then what do you have next, Steve? Then we go to what really is the first Murderino book, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure there were books about Son of Sam and, Helter Skelter about Manson. But this was the one that really put stuff in the framework that of true crime in the form that has it together now. And that's Zodiac by Robert Graysmith, which is still, as far as I'm concerned, even more than Jack the Ripper, the great whodunit. The great unsolved serial killings in the Bay Area in the late 60s and early 70s.
And speaking of obsession, I think this is one where you continue, like this continuously comes up, I think. When, when we talk about murderino kind of things, it definitely does pop up a lot, because there's so much that kind of calls back to the investigative techniques, the way that the serial killer, that the Zodiac killer spoke with the police, and like that game that they were playing back and forth, and like the power of the media and the influence of the media when, when all this was going on, and how,
I mean, it
Facebook,
almost is proto social media.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, both the police and the killer were both using, the newspapers as tools, but also
as a communication device. And
communication device. Yeah.
Incredible.
So, yeah.
And just an amazing story. And it's an amazing whodunit. But as you can see from the last choices I had there, a lot of stuff that I read is nonfiction at this point in time. You'll also notice that there's not a lot of queer literature there. And I think the reason for that is because at the time where I would start, and of course there was stuff that I was exposed to, whether it be Tales of the City or Giovanni's Room that Caleb mentioned. For me, it really was my interest in theater. So for me, it was the works of Terrence McNally or plays like Bent or The Ritz or, even stuff like Cat on the Hot Tin Roof going back to the 50s, or especially this wonderful British play called A Taste of Honey. That was my window into queer issues. So I think that's why there really isn't a lot of queer literature in my canon of favorites. Well, let's put it that way, because it was more theatrical based. That both my personal realization and my exposure to stuff in a somewhat in a connected literary form in terms of playwriting. But that's me. You want to understand me, read those books. And I love that it starts with Grover.
I mean,
and it starts with Grover, ends with a Zodiac killer. That's kind of perfect for me.
I mean, I have to say, I think mine would start with Grover as well. If I had a copy of that with me, I would definitely say that was one of my first influential books. It's just sort of like understanding. Wait, oh my gosh, this is a concept. There's a concept here. It's not just sort of like, this is what words look like.
Yeah.
These are.
And I do worry that I may have skipped some descriptions because it was, again, this is also an audio podcast. When I was describing when conspiracy theories were fun, that was when we were talking about All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein. I may not have gotten the title in there, so my apologies for that.
I think you did. No,
I think you did.
Yeah, All the President's Men. Okay, good. Okay.
Take that next one. Okay, so I'll just talk. I'll kind of do the same thing. I've got eras. I'm doing my Taylor Swift thing. So where Bell started off with Monster at the End of this book, and the works of Judy Blume and Beverly Cleary was also added in my canon as well. I also was a weird kid. I learned to read pretty early, but I was also kind of a loner.
Me too.
So I loved. Yeah, I loved.
I was reading by 4.
Yeah.
We probably have that all in common. I'm certain we were all early readers.
I remember, one of my early school memories was preschool, where, my mom was getting a talking to from one of the teachers about how, like, I wasn't playing with the other kids because I was just too busy, like, off reading on my own. Like, they had to take the books away from me, so I would, like, socialize or something. So, in any case, one of the things that my parents would do, sort of as a treat, like sometimes, if it was like a special day or special occasion, we might go to Toys R Us or something. It's like, and get to look at toys. I was one of those kids that loved going to Walden Books, and
that's where I bought
when I was exactly and when I was 5 years old, my parents were like, "Hey, you need to pick out. It's your birthday. You need to pick out a book." Actually, yes, I was 6. You need to pick out a book that you really, really want, and of course, that book was the illustrated Poe. Was the book that I was like, I need this book. Illustrated, of course, by Greg fucking Hildebrandt himself. So gorgeous plates that really kind of like illustrated a very, ghoulish sensibility. And I don't know, obviously this makes good radio, but there are some beautiful works of art in here. But of course, the main meat of this is Edgar Allan Poe. And like, it's his collected works. So you have The Raven in here. You have The Fall of the House of Usher, soon to be a Netflix series. Mask of the Red Death. And this is stuff that I ate up when I was 6 years old. Like, I would read The Pit and the Pendulum over and over and over again. Cask of Amontillado. I love that stuff. And in fact, I love this book so much. I've had this book with me my entire life. And I actually practicing the letter L's in the back of this book. And Miss Lesham, who was my first grade teacher, because I loved writing her name because it had like the curly L. I mean, like this is the kind of stuff. Oh yeah. For those young people listening, cursive is how we used to write sometimes, and we used to learn how to do that in elementary school. But anyway, so that was one of my big books. I had the weird books that would come up, like Double Trouble about psychic twins. The works of Daniel fucking Pinkwater probably did more to my protosexual self for anything else, because all of his protagonists and like all of the men that he talks about in his books are all just sort of like chubby nerdy dudes with beards. So whatever. But Daniel Pinkwater with Fat Men from Space and the Snark Out Boys and the Avocado Jungle of Death. I mean, like these things are just wild and ridiculous and crazy, and I loved his books. And then finally, this kind of kind of talks about my weird little note here. This was an odd one that I pulled out of my school library in first grade. The Active Enzyme Lemon Freshen Junior High School Witch, which is probably the first book. Oh, you do? Oh, wow. This is one of the first books that had me in absolute hysterics from page one. And I remember sitting in the school library. The librarian had to check on me because I was laughing so hard. She was like, "What are you doing? Nothing in this library is funny like that." And I'm like, "Yes, this book is." And I found a copy of this years later, and I just keep it with me forever. But then, of course, I grew up, I got older, I started reading Stephen King and Dean Koontz, in my late 8 and 9 and 10-year-old self. And I started graduating onto more interesting things, more complex things. I mean, I read the Sideways stories from Wayside School, all those stuff that you read that, in elementary school and junior high. But then I also discovered Terry Pratchett and, stuff like Reaper Man and Soul Music and, Hogfather, everything that kind of came after that. But like, this is one of the first books. And if you can see this is the format of the Science Fiction Book Club, if you guys remember that, when it used to exist. It was just one of those great things, and they had a wonderful catalog. I would order from it, and they all came in their own specific bindings. But of course, I also got into Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury, so the Foundation books and Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. I discovered from Terry Pratchett and from comics, Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett wrote a book together, Good Omens, which of course is now, everybody knows it. But back in the mid 90s, this was such a great, amazing book for me. This is actually the German edition, Ein Gutes Omen. And of course, Neil Gaiman's collection of fiction, Smoke and Mirrors, and a couple of other books. Clive Barker, I kind of got into through Stephen King, where Stephen King was very, let's face it, was very straight. And his stuff was written from a perspective of like a very, cisgendered, heteronormative dude that had like a lot of crazy fantasies and did a lot of cocaine. Clive Barker did a lot of cocaine, but also was super gay and super, super into BDSM and like all sorts of very, dark sexual fantasies. And I loved Cabal. I saw Hellraiser when I was way too young, like when it, like right after it came out, and Hellraiser 2, I remember just like rewatching that over and over again when I was like 10. But he did write some, I would say, more YA friendly stuff. So The Thief of Always, which is a book a lot of people kind of forget about, but this is one of those wonderful novels that's easy to recommend to pretty much everybody, young people, adults. It's not what you would expect from Clive Barker, but there is that kind of like twisted nature that's very Roald Dahl, which is something I also really loved. That kind of British sensibility that's a little bit odd, a little bit off, and very dark, but also humorous and cathartic. But also I was really into British TV and film, and also really into MST3K. And from MST3K, I really got into Ed Wood in high school. And
I have that
Nightmare of
book.
Ecstasy.
Wonderful
Nightmare
book.
of Ecstasy. I
Wonderful book.
love this book. And I think they referenced a lot of Nightmare of Ecstasy in the Ed Wood film that Tim Burton did starring Johnny Depp. But I think this book made me appreciate how amazing and terrible he was as a director, but how complex, multifaceted, and queer he was as a person. Like, I mean, he was a straight man. He was just, he was into women's clothes. He loved drag as a straight man, but he just was such an interesting figure who had so many ideas, just couldn't really get them out properly because he never had enough funding, and worked with people that he loved, but unfortunately were not great actors most of the time. Even poor Bela Lugosi, who did show up in a couple of his films. But I just I love this book, and this kind of like pushed me through high school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing the Burton film doesn't go into is how tragic his ending was.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Which I actually think it's a better film for it. But if you read some of the end of life stuff, and it's just harrowing. But that's a fantastic book.
Oh yeah, I just and yeah, to that point, if most of what people know of Ed Wood is either from the movie or from Plan 9 from Outer Space, or Bride of the is it Bride of the Monster? No, the Bride of the Atom, or however many other titles that thing has. There's so much more to him and to his story, and very sad end. That kind of brings me to college and shit, where I started reading a lot more nonfiction, and I got very interested into alternative kind of books. One of them, of course, is the Griffin and Sabine series, which was a series of 5 total novels that are told through letters and postcards that are meticulously created, including envelopes that you can actually open up and pull out cards and handwritten letters and all sorts of things. And that's how the story is told.
This is the book that gave birth to Matt Kent.
Oh, absolutely. If Matt Kent, it would shock me if Matt Kent never read anything by Nick Bantock, because Nick Bantock himself, graphic designer, and just loves little things into other little things and all sorts of stuff. And I seem to have dropped an interesting playing card / ticket that is stamped. That's part of the story. But also, I got into fairy tales from a critical standpoint. So Maria Tatter's annotated fairy tales, being able to really delve into the meaning and the history and the cultural significance of what a fairy tale is, what a folk tale is. That was something I spent so much time reading. But I also started getting into nonfiction, getting into autobiography, getting into memoir and essays. And some of what I really love is humor. So I love sort of like hilarious personal, sometimes at the cost of pain or, embarrassment, but works by people like Jakob Hein, who wrote about his upbringing in East Germany. David Rakoff, the Canadian satirist and writer who unfortunately died way too young, with some of his books like Fraud, where he talks about writing and himself. Sarah Vowell. Oh my God. Brilliant Sarah Vowell. Like NPR, This American Life darling Sarah Vowell, and her amazing works about herself, but also about history and the weird things that happen in American history. This is just one of several. I have everything that she's ever written, and I love her pieces.
My favorite is Assassination Vacation. That's my favorite.
Oh, right here, Assassination Vacation.
That's what you have there?
So good. Yeah.
Okay.
This is the hardcover.
And her audiobooks are
just listening to her. I just love listening to her read, because I discovered her through NPR, through This American Life, and I'm like, oh, her books sound like her.
Yeah.
Which, duh. Of course, David Sedaris. I have everything that he's ever written. But occasionally I will go into something that's not humor. Here If You Need Me, which is a book by Kate Braestrup, who is, I think, Maine's, or was at the time, Maine's only forestry chaplain. She was part of the forest, the Forest Service up in Maine. and is also a minister, and became a minister after her husband, who was a chaplain, died tragically. And she took over for him. She went to divinity school. She had her crisis of faith, and somehow came out the other end like this. And this is a truly heartfelt book that I recommend to a lot of people who are either struggling with questions of faith or just want to, understand how people of faith, can kind of go through their own journeys and their own struggles, and come out stronger for it. You don't have to believe or ascribe to anything that she believes to really love this book. And then also for fiction, I went back again, but this time in reading comics too, I discovered Hero by Perry Moore. Perry Moore, who unfortunately was cut short, his life was cut short way too soon. This book was probably, it's fiction, it's queer lit, with a gay, child of a superhero. And it's such a powerful book for what it was. It's one of the first ones, I think, probably where, queerness and superhero, in a YA package, I believe this was a YA book when it was published, just really kind of hit all the high notes, in making just a book that's heartfelt, has cool superheroing, and villainy, but also just has a young coming out experience, that shows, that although our stories are unique, there's a lot of shared experience. But yeah, I mean, these were just all books that I started after college and through college. Like, I really just kind of grew into these genres, and I read a lot of nonfiction, mostly autobiography and memoir, normally. But with the Queer Book Club, the great thing about that is that I'm exposed to that from a queer perspective, but also other prose, romance, and history books, lots of like When Brooklyn Was Queer, great, or Everybody Passes, or Gender Cowboys, just a lot of really great queer works, that otherwise I may not have known about, but get to read on a monthly basis. So, yeah. Sorry, that went a long while.
No, it's so funny. I was worried we were going to not have 90 minutes. And we're still going. So here we go.
We're still going. Thank you for all those who are still hanging on.
Right. Over to the youngest.
Yeah, so I am significantly less interesting than both of you after listening to those. So I, like both of you, I started reading very early, was very obsessed with books, and read as much as I could. Yeah, I don't know if your local library did that thing where there was like a contest to see who could read the most books and whatever. I won that like 7 years in a row. It was ridiculous. Yeah, that was just my favorite thing to do as a kid. I lived at the library. I loved it, right? So the fact that my dad, as I think I've talked about this, it's a Church of Christ preacher, very devout. So, like it is not conjecture to say that my earliest literary experiences are biblical, right? So that was something that we read all the time. And that's something I saw my dad doing all the time, whether he was reading annotations or the Bible or, different books on the Bible that he just did. And so that I picked up on that and ran with it. So lots of early biblical references in my works, but in my reading experience. But then I got to school and I started reading books, and really got into the literary works of Dr. Seuss. Obviously that was kind of a joke, but I mean, yeah, I remember sitting at my grandparents reading Redfish to Bluefish. So going from there, once I got into school and I discovered the library and these other books, as a very early reader, who was just voracious, I was reading the first series that I really glommed onto was a series by a writer named Brian Jacques. It's called Redwall. And throughout the entire, he wrote a bunch of different books, but it's a fantasy series told through the eyes of anthropomorphic animals, in this Britanized world where, these mice and these squirrels and everything, they have a society, and the book is told linearly, and it goes through these different iterations and families, and, these figures that are in books, one are the great grandparents and these legendary figures of folks who are in the books later on. So he tells this lineage of stories, and that really got me into fantasy. And from there, I'd fall in love with writers like Terry Brooks and the Shannara series, the not the TV show, but just the really beloved adventure fantasy series that got into orcs and elks and elves and magic and stuff. And I tried reading Tolkien in early school, and that just didn't work for me. But I could read Terry Brooks, and I devoured it. But then, like a lot of you guys, I got into other stories, besides fantasy, and that was great and all. But I wanted to read different things, and so I really got into writers like Patricia Cornwell. And while not Murderino, Patricia Cornwell, she is in real life, she's a forensic pathologist, and that's the way she wrote her novels. And The Body Farm really did change the way that I knew that books could be written. I was also really into R.L. Stine early on, reading that kind of just fun kid, horror for kids, which then morphed into me reading, Clive Barker, right, and really falling in love with the leather-clad BDSM midnight meat train world that he lived in. And I could read the books when I couldn't watch the movies because my parents wouldn't let me, right? And so I fell in love with those stories and just really got into them. Got really into, and this is probably not in anybody's wheelhouse but mine, but the romance novels by Jerome Dickey. I don't know if you guys have ever even heard that name. He's a African American writer who wrote, just really sex-centric romance books, and they were, to me, as a early on burgeoning pubescent boy, I was just like, okay, this is basically porn. And I can read this, but I can paint the picture. Cornwell was one of the first queer experiences I had, because there's a character in there who's a lesbian, and then Jerome Dickey had gay characters and stuff too, and sexually fluid characters, and I thought that was really great, and just really, just devoured those. But I was the only white country kid in Arkansas probably reading Jerome Dickey.
Is Caleb frozen?
But I still enjoy it. Right? It's not exactly fun. Oh, did I break up?
You were frozen.
You've been freezing just a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Dickey was the Gideon series, right?
Don't recall off the top of my head. Okay. I'll look it up and let you know.
Anyway, it's ringing a bell. Okay.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it was just, like I said, it's very, very modern porn. Just people, weird relationships and fucking. But then you get into your kind of high school lit classes, and I got to say, Bill, you already covered this, but The Outsiders had a huge, profound impact on me, and Rumblefish did as well. I loved S.E. Hinton, and my mind was blown when I found out that S.E. Hinton was a woman, or was a girl. Yeah. I did not fathom that a girl could write a book like that when I was in 5th grade, and then a teacher who turned out to be queer later on, is the one who fed that to me, and it, just kind of blew my mind. It just took off. But from there, getting into high school, getting into Southern literature, which, I've said for years that Faulkner is one of my favorite writers. And so As I Lay Dying was a book that I read probably in junior high that just changed the way that I could understand that books can be written and read. And one of the scenes in that book where the mother is laying in bed watching her son build her coffin outside the window, that scene just lives in my head rent free. Found, from Faulkner, again, I did not have a lot of people pushing me to read stuff that wasn't, in my wheelhouse. So it would be years later that I would find, James Baldwin, who is my favorite writer of all time now, but it would be years later when I was in college, the first go around, that I would find him. But yeah, just that kind of stuff. And then I got into as we all did, the nonfiction stuff. I literally, my school had a program to where you had to read books and take a test on the computer for them to get points, and accelerated reading and stuff like that. I read Steven Spielberg's biography in 1st grade, the entire thing. The teachers and my mother got in an argument because she's like, no, if he wants to read it, let him read it. If he fails, he won't get the points, and then he'll have to struggle and make up. He can read a bunch of bullshit and get the points because he's already done that, right? But let him read it. And I did. And loved that book and fell in love with nonfiction. As I would get older and get into music and stuff like that, books like the Led Zeppelin biography, The Hammer of the Gods, I devoured that. Books about bands I don't even necessarily like their music per se. The Grateful Dead, A Long Strange Trip, man. That book is amazing. Even if you don't like their music, if you're not a fan of jam band and you're not a Deadhead, read A Long Strange Trip, because it is in fact a long strange trip. It is a fascinating biography about these people in the Haight-Ashbury district, right? And you'll see Hendrix, and you'll see all of these other figures that loop into there, and Janis, and all of them, right? The Doors have a great biography. I read that.
No one
Again,
here gets out alive. Yeah.
like,
And a lot of it might be bullshit, but it's a great read.
Well, for me, the takeaway from that book was Ray Manzarek, right? Like he was not a name I knew, but just after reading that book, I was like, okay, that dude's a powerhouse of music, right?
Yeah.
And then started reading books about bands that I was listening to at the time. He's a piece of shit. I'm not ever going to make the argument that he's not. Marilyn Manson's a scumbag, flat out, but his book, Long Road Out of Hell, I think it is, that biography, fascinating. And again, probably half of it's bullshit, but it is a amazing read, right? But just reading about all of these figures, and Eisenhower, read a couple books about Eisenhower. Guy, like a lot of kids, just got really into Eisenhower in like 10th grade and stuff. But yeah, so that's the stuff that I was reading. Now, again, I still read a lot. Most of the stuff I read is nonfiction these days. I like literary short stories. Very much into that work. Anything by Amina Gautier that she writes, I'm going to read. I think she's fascinating. Just brilliant stuff. And then actually a buddy of mine that I went to college with this go around, who graduated a little bit before I am, just signed his first book deal. Jared Lemus is his name. And he teaches at I forget which college he's at now, but he just signed his first book deal, and I'm super proud of him. And so I get to be a part of this little weird, like, literary world. And it's super fun. But yeah, those are the books that kind of just made me, especially the Patricia Cornwell stuff. Like those books, just there's so much in there that can be appreciated. So yeah.
Pretty wild. It's really interesting. I think I'm seeing some commonalities, among us, the age we started reading, different reasons for why things connected with us, but there's some alignments.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting. And then, like now you're talking about it, I'm thinking of all the things I didn't mention, like Hemingway.
Yeah.
And, biographies on, there's certain people that fascinate. George S. Patton fascinates me.
Mm-hmm.
Teddy Roosevelt. I've read a lot Teddy Roosevelt. I've read, Jonestown. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I'm not even like scratching the surface of the other stuff. It's amazing.
Well, and what's like, I've got all of the books that for some reason, like all the books that I deeply love, like all of my Hemingway, Charles, my Dickens books, all of those are on my bookshelf in my law office. Like, just because I don't know when I'm going to pick them up and read them again. So I'm like, let me just put them up here. And this kind of says who I am to people who walk in my office.
Yeah. I also like how you went more of like a fantasy route when you were looking at fiction. You went with a lot of fantasy, whereas I did some fantasy through a very specific type of like twisted, sarcastic British fantasy.
Yeah.
But mostly what I read was sci-fi. Like I read a lot of sci-fi. I even talk about. I also devoured every stupid Robotech novel that they came out with. That they wrote.
And they're long.
They're long. Some of them are huge.
Yes, they're not short.
Yeah, and see, I went the other direction. Like I wish I had a peer group when I was growing up that could have played games like D&D and Vampire the Masquerade, which I did find eventually when I got into those games. But early on, I didn't have that. So what I would do is when we would go to Little Rock, and I think I've told you this story, like I had braces. And so we would go to Little Rock once a month to go see the orthodontist. And that's when I would go to Walden Books, right? And that's when I would go and get a few comic books. But I would also pick up books like Dragonlance, all of those books, the Vampire the Masquerade novels and stuff like that. All of these books that were connected to these games, the Warhammer and stuff and I didn't read a lot of Warhammer, but a lot of the D&D stuff that I wish I could have played with friends. But I lived in a town with 600 people and like 3 of us were nerds. So, it's just like all of that stuff. And I would read that and just, dive into those worlds that were fantasy. Anne Rice was a big, I love Anne Rice. I loved her books. And, looking back now, there are definitely better vampire stories out there. But at the time, it wasn't Twilight. So,
no.
Hey, that's it. We actually have a lot of comments. I did want to pop them up real quick. James Figueredo said, Liga McNeil's Please Kill Me is a great book about punk. Genre punk in this case.
Please Kill Me relates primarily to the New York scene. The thing that Please Kill Me gave us is the changing narrative. And you'll see this there's a book on Saturday Night Live about this. Bendis even adopted it for that Avengers book he did, where it's like eventually it's essentially the Avengers being interviewed. John Lydon applies it in his autobiography, his first autobiography. It's a great device, and that really stems from Please Kill Me. That's the first book that I know that really provided that.
Vernon Williams actually was commenting when you were talking about, when we were going through your books, Bill, music and murder. Actually, and movies. So like movies, music, murder. Yeah.
Now, if you could have a book that combined music and murder, like an extensive book about Bobby Fuller's murder, or I'd be in heaven. I'd be in heaven. There's not a lot there.
Yeah, James, again, Clive Barker did a lot of cocaine. Also Dick. Very true.
I just want to go back to that, Steve, though, when you were talking about Stephen King being all cis. I do think that there are books, even before he began writing gay characters, and that's a later development. But I do see some queer sensibility in things like in Salem's Lot, and also particularly in Christine, in terms of that forbidden romance kind of element.
But it is also it is still very
I'd love
straight.
To hear John Runyon's hubby.
Because John Runyon's Ken is a huge Stephen King guy. I mean, like with Stephen King, I mean, when he does touch on queer ideas, like mostly gay male ideas, it's done from a lens from somebody who doesn't really understand it. So there's a lot of violence usually involved, humiliation.
That's true. Yeah.
Kind of comes out in there. Like, several of his characters in several of the big books, The Stand, in It.
The Stand, the most interesting character in The Stand is a bisexual woman.
Well, yes, but also, I forget his name, but he's left without a name mostly. But he's kind of gone insane, and he runs around. And he's like really into nuclear missiles. But he has a really terrifying, gay encounter where he's raped. And also other characters that come up, sort of like gayness is kind of like it's shameful, it's traumatic and all that. So I think obviously he kind of grew out of that after the 80s and like the early 90s, but so did a lot of people, I think, because they weren't really exposed to queerness in that sense. But whereas Clive Barker was like, hey dudes, I like sucking dick, and so here's like a whole bunch of stuff, and leather and pain and exposing your inner self through suffering.
I'm not comparing
this pleasure at all. Like there's lots of interesting stuff there.
I'm not comparing.
But Vernon also comes back here. Elin Harris was his Jerome Dickey.
Okay.
And I do know Elin Harris. Serial killer using musical clues. Yeah, that would be an interesting book.
That's part of Zodiac, though, with the references to Gilbert and Sullivan.
Oh, there you go. Okay, it's been done. And then Dell and the Green Mile. Yeah, exactly. These characters that. But no, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff that we've read over the years, and I think obviously tastes have changed. I think our tastes have evolved and changed, but there's something to say with like the books that we read when we were younger. Obviously, inform the way that we approach the other books that we come to love as well. I think that if we didn't read these books when we were younger, if we didn't read these types of genres, we wouldn't have that kind of like knowledge, that kind of understanding to grow into these other genres either. And I think just like most readers, if you are a reader, your tastes have really kind of collect from everything, and they grow and they develop and they evolve. But the books that we started with, they still mean a lot. And it's amazing how I can look at something like The Thief of All Ways, or
fucking Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, man. Like
Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the first one. Yeah, I mean, like,
That's
just
way
good
after my
memories.
time. That's way
God,
after.
I
Memories
love
are
that book.
just
Yeah.
insane. You know, and looking at the Poe book, I flipped this out. This is over. It's right over here. I have a bookshelf that's right here. I pull this up every once in a while. I just flip through it, reread The Raven, look at some of the artwork that Greg Hildebrandt did. Which, by the way, if you aren't a fan of Greg Hildebrandt's beautiful work, then
You are now.
You are like I don't know if you could find this book. If it's
I
like
have a
urban
question though.
reprinted.
Is it Greg or is it the brothers?
No, this is Greg himself.
That's
So
Greg
it doesn't
himself.
have. I think Eric Hildebrandt is the other brother.
Yeah, and some of their work ethic was fascinating. One would start, and the other would go to bed, and the other one would take over, and that process was wild. Yeah,
but yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think it's good. But it was funny, this exercise, kind of like looking at the books that mean a lot to us, and kind of pulling from that. It's like, whoa, I read that. I really like that. I don't know how I got to there from here, but you know,
are through lines. There are through lines.
Yeah.
All right.
But you know,
well, I know this is something I kind of hoisted on you guys because, well, foisted. Let's put it that way. Just because because like I'm so far behind in the comic book reading, and something happened today that didn't help. But we'll get back on that track. But as a one episode diversion, I really, really enjoyed this.
This is fun.
Yeah.
You know, what I would like to do sometime in the future is, if we're going to do an episode like this, we do something similar for music, and we do like 10 songs, like just narrow it down to a song, 10 songs from age that we enjoyed from age 12 to 20, right? Just in that.
Okay. I almost haven't picked out. Okay.
Yeah, from like 10 to 20, and we do 10 songs that
don't
like,
you think it's also just as interesting, the stuff that hits you when you're older too?
Oh no, absolutely, especially from a retrospective standpoint.
Yeah, and also my musical experience really starts at like 5 or 6. I mean, like I was buying records because of an act at age 6.
Yeah.
So we'll hash it out, but we'll have another episode like this. Oh,
dead buddy,
Phoebe.
For those of you who are listening, Phoebe just jumped up in Steve's laps, and she's an adorable little puppy.
Yeah,
and she's getting some snuggles from Daddy.
Yeah, and with a sweater.
Yeah, this is her new green harness. She had a blue one, but she like ripped off one of the things.
Okay, well, we've been with you for over 2 hours, so we really got to start wrapping this up. And when we wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears up, we have 2 segments that basically signal the end. The first is where we show off our Geek Gets. And Steve usually doesn't have Geek Gets, but I think he's got something this week.
Oh, I do. I have a couple things, but I'll just kind of
just do the one.
A few things up. So yeah, I know.
Fun.
But I think you have these too. So,
right? Am I right? Okay.
Wendy's now has DC character boxes. They come with three little figurines and 3 little sort of like collector cards. They are actually pretty awesome, shockingly. So here's Aquaman with his little wrist. Interestingly.
Yeah, can you show that a little bit? Can you show that a little bit? Enchanté.
Oh, Aquaman, is he a little, and then also
swimming with me.
But they come in sets of 3, and usually the sets actually do have some kind of connective tissue. So like one set is Superman, Supergirl, and Lex Luthor. Another one is Batman, Nightwing, and Catwoman. Like there's some really cool stuff here. So if you're not afraid of going to Wendy's and getting a little kids meal, pick one of these up.
So my wolf of the week, not wolf of the week, sorry, my Geek Get, I'm going to back up a little bit, it's actually a comic. So I was able to pick up at a pretty decent price from cheapgraphicnovels.com a story that I've been really, really, really wanting a hardcover for, and that is Superman Birthright.
Okay.
So I'm super excited about this. It's still in the plastique, so I'm super excited to read this because I don't think I ever actually read the whole thing. I think I started it at one point and never finished it. And so I'm stoked about reading that. So that's my Geek Get for the week.
It's worthwhile. definitely worthwhile. My Geek It relates to why I did not have a show 2 weeks ago, in that I attended the Out and Equal Workplace Summit. That's the official name for it, where a bunch of LGBTQIA plus individuals in the corporate world get together and discuss being queers in the corporate world. That's basically it. But it was a very valuable time. But I was able to extend my trip since it was held in Orlando. I was able to go to, where do you think?
Disney World.
Universal.
Well, I went to Galaxy's Edge as part of the Disney Hollywood Studios.
Yay.
And I went to see the Millennium Falcon in person. I went to Smuggler's Run. I went to Rise of the Resistance. I also went to, and this is something I don't think gets enough credit, is the revised Star Tours. It is awesome. And the best thing about that is I was with my best friend, Stu Scheinman, who I've known since 1974. And just had a wonderful time being a 9-year-old kid again. And
awesome.
When you kind of have to get souvenirs when you're at a theme park. But, you know, I didn't want to get like a hoodie with R2-D2. I didn't want to get something like that. So I got action figures that are theme park exclusives and Shop Disney exclusives. So I got R2 Sam, which is a version of R2-D2 that's like the version that's serving the drinks in Return of the Jedi. These are all from the Droid Factory line. I also got C1 Monster 4, which is a Frankenstein version of Chopper, which I think is really cool. And then best of all, from the Star Wars Pride collection from Droid Factory, I got BBU, which is a Pride-themed BBU. So that's my version of a theme park souvenir, and that's my Geek It. All right. So we're wrapping this up now for real. And when we do wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears up, we do so as a segment we call the Woofs of the Week. In the bear community, if you find a fellow attractive, you woof at him. And we do something similar where we woof at what may be a comic book, but may also be a film or a TV program or a charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener or viewer, may be interested in sampling. I'll start as I always do with Steve. Steve, what is your Woof of the Week?
Well, since I picked it as my Wolf of the Week last time, back at the end of August, I can't really talk about Starfield, even though I've been playing it nonstop since September 1st. So I'll talk about Theater Camp, which is a recent release that is now out on Hulu. So if you have Hulu, you can watch it. It basically is kind of like the newest generation's version of the movie Camp, which it itself was kind of reminiscent of Fame. So kids at a theater camp, and there's obviously another plot around trying to save the camp by making enough money, but it's just fun and funny, and yes, you can recognize a lot of people if you know anybody in theater or drama. They're all in there, including behind the scenes and the production crew. So Theater Camp, available on Hulu.
All right, over to Caleb. Caleb, what is your Wolf of the Week?
My Wolf of the Week goes to something that just came in today, and that is the new Conway the Machine album. Now, if you're not into hip hop, you may not know who Conway the Machine is. I love this dude. I've been following him for a long time. He's part of that subgenre called cocaine rap. Used to be part of the Griselda family with his brother, Benny the Butcher, but they have since split ways. This is his first kind of real solo album since he's branched off from the Griselda family of hip hop. Love this album, so super excited to break this open and put it on the turntable. Really good hip hop if you're a fan.
Okay, for my Wolf of the Week, I'm also musically oriented, and the reason why we didn't have a show last week was because I was in attendance at the Death Cab for Cutie Postal Service 20th anniversary tour in 2003. Death Cab for Cutie released Transatlanticism, and in the same year, the Postal Service released Give Up. They are both acts that are led by Ben Gibbard, who by my estimation is probably the best songwriter living right now, at least in terms of the work that he's providing. And So the Wolf actually goes out to the tour itself. If you are on the West Coast, I believe they're in Colorado tomorrow, and they have dates in Arizona and in Seattle and in various areas of Texas and California. So if you are in those areas, please go see this stuff. It's amazing to think that these two albums were released within 8 months of each other. And as my tour souvenirs, I got the vinyl copies. I've never had vinyls before.
Nice.
And
So cool.
I'm not embarrassed to say there's one particular song by Death Cab for Cutie called Expo 86, and I was crying like a little baby because though the song's about a breakup, there are also some lyrics that can be interpreted as it's about being old, growing older. And for as much impact that hit me at age 36, you can't imagine what it hit me at age 56. Hearing those lyrics live is really something. So, and also if you're unfamiliar with this music, Postal Service is more electronic oriented. Death Cab for Cutie is a bit more indie rock. Again, the connective tissue between the same leader of both acts. Go check it out. It's all good stuff. All right. So thank you, gentlemen, for this this little diversion. It was awesome. I got books to read now that are on my list because of the things that you discussed. And, just in terms of a perspective of who we are, it's a wonderful discussion. There's things about myself that I'm seeing in the choices I made when we were deciding what books to talk about. Mm-hmm. It's really something, where you kind of recognize the stuff that stayed with you. It's really something. Very interesting exercise. So again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram, the X, whatever, as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. If you want to listen to us, you can do so through Apple Podcasts, through Spotify, through Google Play, and through what's the other one? Amazon podcast. Yeah. So spreading the word. Now the stitches no more. Also, if you want to write to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. If you join us through Facebook Live, thank you. If you're watching us a little later from YouTube, thank you. Please like and subscribe on that platform as well. So until next time, I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Steve Morey.
And I'm Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
If you're listening to the audio version, you're going to hear a woof and an explosion. We'll be back real soon. Take care, everyone.
Woof.